I'm Karen Becker, Assistant Director of Camera's Media Response Team, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today. Camera is honored to have this conversation with Aviva Klompus. If you're not familiar with Camera, our mission is to promote fair and accurate coverage of Israel in the mainstream media. Our researchers prompt hundreds of media corrections each year. Our volunteer activists publish letters to editors in newspapers around the country and around the world. And our campus fellows work hard to correct misrepresentations about Israel at colleges and universities. Our new Education Institute is also focusing on issues in K-12 education. Aviva is the co-founder and CEO of Boundless, a think action tank that promotes engagement with Israel and combats Jew hatred. Previously, she was the director of speechwriting for Israel's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York City. As the chief speechwriter for Ambassador Ron Prosser, Aviva crafted highly acclaimed speeches that informed public opinion. Aviva's work has appeared in the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, the Jerusalem Post, and other international publications. She is the author of Speaking for Israel, a memoir about her time as speechwriter at the UN. Aviva will speak about breaking free of the echo chamber with messages that resonate for about 30 minutes, and then I'll read her your questions that you can put in the chat box. If you run your cursor at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. Click there and type your questions during the program. We'll try to get to as many of your questions and comments as we can. And with that, it's my privilege to turn this over to Aviva Klompus.
Thank you so very much, Karen, and a big, big thank you to Camera for inviting me to address all of you today. I am going to talk to you today about messages that resonate, but I really want to lay out the landscape of what is happening on social media so that we can get a better understanding of the challenges. As Karen said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Boundless. We are a national organization. We work on a number of issues, but where I spend the majority of my time is trying to understand the narrative battle that is taking place, both with regard to Israel as well as in regard to anti-Semitism. As a think action tank, we understand that the first thing we need to do is go below the surface and understand what is causing these challenges. Where is it originating from? So that we can then go and develop better interventions. So I'm going to share some slides with you. So my question for you when you think about social media is, does it feel a lot like this? Does it feel like you are spinning in circles, trying to win a race to you're not quite sure where? It's quite disorienting and possibly even a little bit dangerous. This is what social media feels like to me. Well, when we look at what's happening on social media, first we start with the question of why should we care? Obviously, for the Jewish community, it's very personal because we see a lot of lies being spread and misinformation and disinformation spread. But I want to step back and look at it in the context of what's actually happening in the world. So every year, the World Economic Forum, at the beginning of the year in January, will put out its global risk report. And this is where it assesses what it believes to be the greatest risk to the world in the short term, so in the next 2 years, as well as in the longer term, so in the next 10 years. So this year, in January of 2024, for the first time in the survey's history, there were 2 new categories put onto the risk list, and they were misinformation, disinformation, as well as cyber insecurity. And this came ahead of some of the challenges that have appeared on this list in previous years, like economic weakness or climate change or even war. And you can also see that number 3 on the list is societal polarization, the breakdowns of social norms and the increase in tribalism. So this issue of misinformation and disinformation is an enormous problem and a perceived threat for the entire world. And that's really where I want to focus. And just for people that might not be sure about the distinction, misinformation is inaccurate information. So that's when you get the facts wrong. Whereas disinformation is a deliberate attempt to mislead. And that's actually where we're going to spend most of our time. Where people get their information enormously influences whether they support Israel or Hamas in this war. So what you can see here is the supporters of Israel are shown in blue. So individuals who predominantly get their news and information about the war from government sources, both Israeli and US, as well as mainstream major news organizations or academic centers, they are far more likely to support Israel in this war. Individuals who primarily get their news and information from their friends, their family, and social media are far more likely to support Hamas in this war. We also know that social media has just overtaken legacy media in terms of where people are getting information. So as an example, you can look at how many times you see the hashtag Free Palestine or other pro-Palestinian hashtags on TikTok, and you can compare the scale, the magnitude of that against the news on all of these types of mainstream news sites, New York Times, CNN, Fox, Post, USA Today, etc. And what you can see is that the order of magnitude is far more people are being exposed to this hashtag Free Palestine, which for the most part is not saying anything complimentary about Israel, than they are from mainstream media. So it's no surprise that when we look at the Harvard-Harris polls that come out every month, you can see that amongst the youngest category that they poll, 18 to 24-year-olds, around half support Hamas in this war. One of the greatest correlations between whether you support Israel or Hamas in the war has to do with both age and education. The older you are, the more likely you are to support Israel, the more education you have about Israel, the conflict, Jewish people, the history of the connection between Jewish people and Israel, the more likely you are to support, again, Israel, if you have more education. And of course, I don't have to tell you that anti-Semitic incidents have been soaring in this country. And we saw, we're coming into the summer, but we've been seeing just tent encampments all over the United States and obviously in other cities in Canada and across Europe as well. So I want to pick apart for you some of the reasons why things go so dramatically badly for us on social media. So one problem is the fact that we in the Jewish community, even if we all uniformly believed and thought the same thing, which is absolutely impossible, we would be 15 million people in a world of almost 8 billion people. So just in the sheer scale of size between us and them, so to speak, we're off. But as we know, even in the Jewish community, we don't have homogenous opinions. So there's more that's going on when we start to pick apart the surface of social media. The first thing I want to explain to you is the existence of echo chambers. And one thing that my organization, Boundless, did was an entire study just to understand what exactly these echo chambers are looking like. And we chose to do this study on X because it is where journalists predominantly are still getting their information. It's still where thought leadership and conversations happen. It's not where younger people are congregating for information, but it's certainly influencing, as Elon Musk would say, it is sort of the public town square. So what we did was we went and we visually mapped 1 month of conversation of the Israeli-Palestinian discourse. This is what it looks like. If you were to take 1 month of conversation on everything happening on Twitter or X, and you were to create a visual representation, it would look like this galaxy map. And essentially every dot is engagement. The larger the dot, the higher the engagement, meaning there was a comment, there was a like, there was a retweet, or there was a quote tweet. And you can see that the bulk of the conversation, the height of the activity is happening right here. So when we went and we said, okay, well, where is the pro-Israel, pro-Jewish community? They're over here. So immediately what you can see is the visualization of what it means to exist in an echo chamber. We are smaller, much smaller, and we're not participating in the larger conversation at all. This is where the main conversation is happening, and we're over here. So we're smaller and we're distinct from the main conversation. If I go and I zoom in on what's inside of this red circle, what you would see is this. It looks like a giant yarn ball. And what essentially, if I were to zoom in more, it's not really important, but you would see that every node is an account, probably a lot of the people that you follow. But really what this allows us to see, the color coding shows us who interacts with whom. But when we look at it as sort of a yarn ball, you can see it doesn't matter. This purple section's sort of talking to each other, the green section's talking to each other. But as a whole, we're all talking to one another. This is the epitome of what it means to be in an echo chamber. And it's not just on social media. The reality is that we actually live in echo chambers. The people that we're spending our time with, that we're going to be talking to, especially about contentious issues, about the war, about anti-Semitism, about politics in general, we tend to silo ourselves and create these echo chambers because it's more comfortable than engaging with the rest of the world. And we tend to get information that just goes and affirms what we already believe. Huge problem. The next problem that we face on social media is that the algorithms are not pure. There is deep manipulation of the algorithms, and they differ on different platforms. But let's look at TikTok, because this one has gotten some headlines. So TikTok has about 1.5 billion users. Instagram has about 2 billion users. And what this allows us to do is that we can do comparisons. We can take a topic on Instagram and we can take a topic on TikTok, and we can sort of assess them, because for any given topic, you would see that there should be around the same rates of engagement. Meaning if people are talking about whatever, some sports event, it should be in proportion the same amount on both platforms, because that would just be an organic conversation. But that's not what happens always. So we know TikTok is owned by the Chinese company ByteDance, and that has sparked a lot of concern and some legislation in the United States. So there was a study that was done by scientists at NCRI, the Network Contagion Research Institute, and this is what they found. They found that there are certain topics on TikTok that when you compare them to Instagram, you are not seeing an even proportion. Meaning that on TikTok, there are certain topics that are being amplified by the algorithms, and there are certain topics that are being suppressed or muted by the algorithms. So it's very clearly what you can see in what is in China's interest. So anything that has to do with the Uyghurs, on Instagram, you'll see high rates of engagement, but look at the red. It's highly, highly suppressed on TikTok, meaning the algorithms are muting them so that they won't spread. Same thing for Hong Kong. You'll see quite a lot of conversation about it on Instagram, same for Tiananmen Square, same for South China Sea, and you see almost no discourse on TikTok. Same thing for Tibet, Dalai Lama. So there's very clearly algorithmic manipulation that takes place. We know on TikTok, there happens to be amplification of anti-American content as well, because again, that would be in the interests of the Chinese government. So we have echo chambers, we have algorithmic manipulation, and then we have inauthentic activity, which is another way of asking, are you arguing with a robot? How many of these accounts that you're seeing online and that perhaps you're interacting with and having a conversation with have a real human behind them? And the answer is not that many. So there's a company called Cyabra. They're an Israeli-based social threat intelligence company, and they've done numerous assessments of online conversations as it relates to the war over the past 7 months. And what they have found is that 26% of the profiles are fake. So 26% of the time, there's a 26% chance you are arguing with a robot. They found in particular that after October 7th, there were tens of thousands of fake accounts that are posting hundreds of times a day. So these accounts had existed for more than a year, but they had been basically silent. And then all of a sudden, they were activated. And any account that's posting hundreds of times a day is not real. That's being inauthentic. And what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the algorithms. It's another way of trying to manipulate the algorithms. And it's essentially by taking whatever is trending. And what they would do was take what's trending as topics about Israel, which normally are used by the pro-Israel community, but they were using them in order to pop out of their echo chamber and more into our echo chamber. The more you're able to bust out of an echo chamber, the more you're able to achieve virality. So by essentially piggybacking on our conversations, they were able to expand their reach on social media. Right after October 7th, when we were still stunned and horrified and seeing these horrific videos, there were 3 large disinformation campaigns that were being pushed in a big way. We were seeing the videos, this very famous video of Shiri Bibas and her 2 children. So what they were pushing online were claims that Hamas is humane and compassionate, and that the hostages would be treated in a humane manner. The second disinformation campaign that was being pushed was that it was a necessity for Hamas to commit the October 7th attack because there was an imminent threat. There was an imminent threat to Al-Aqsa Mosque, that they were spreading rumors that Israel was about to move on Al-Aqsa. So in order to defend Al-Aqsa, Hamas had to go and attack us. And the third was a disinformation campaign that was spreading in Arabic, that this was the only way that to release the Palestinian prisoners that were serving life sentences in Israel. This had to be done in order to free the prisoners. We also saw a massive disinformation campaign after Iran fired or launched those hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles attack. That was on Saturday, April 13th. Again, 26% of the accounts that were participating in conversations about that were fake accounts. And they were pushing again, 3 disinformation campaigns. One was to grow strength for Iran. The second was to make people fearful that there would be a third world war. And of course, the third one was to demonize Israel and to portray it as a terrorist state. And those fake campaigns were able to garner hundreds and hundreds of millions of views. Another nefarious tactics that's used actually both by foreign actors as well as, it happens quite commonly here, by domestic actors, by fringe right, far right, and far left groups, is something called sock puppets. Those are fake accounts that will look like this Elaine Goldschmidt. Elaine Goldschmidt is not a real person. It's not a real account. This is a sock puppet. This was created by far right white nationalists. They created a profile and a name that looked like someone from the Jewish community. And then they go and they post absolutely horribly offensive statements. And the idea is they're creating accounts that will infiltrate different communities. So there'd be an Elaine Goldschmidt and there'd be accounts that were infiltrating, let's say, the Black community. And then they would wage open warfare between these sock puppet accounts. And the whole purpose is to sow discord between various minority communities. The idea is that if the Jewish community and the Black community are fighting one another, that's only to the benefit of far-right white supremacists. And that's a very common tactic that they utilize as well. So it's another question of, this is not a bot, there is a person behind it, but again, it's inauthentic activity. And then we have foreign intervention. So as an example, this information comes from TikTok. And what we did was we wanted to, again, look at that free hashtag Palestine and understand where it was originating from. And you can see it's predominantly originating from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries, Russia, China, etc. And what this is again, that it shows us these are places where you see large bot farms. So this is, again, not authentic activity. This is not representative of public opinion. This is, again, foreign intervention that's pushing a narrative online. Okay, another video. So having outlined all of that, I'm sure it feels quite a bit like this. We're in quite a mess. Not clear what to do about it. Everything's a little bit upside down. Goes from bad to worse. Okay. So let's look at the narrative war. Social media is a new tactic, and it's an ability to spread information faster and farther than we ever have before in the history of the world. But the strategy of what's underlying these narratives is an old one, and it starts during the Cold War. After World War II, the Middle East becomes the forward operating base in a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Why? Because you don't want to fight a war on your own territory if you can avoid it. You would rather fight it somewhere else and keep the fight far from home. And that's what happens in the Middle East. As Israel moves from its socialist roots and it becomes a democracy, as it embraces capitalism, it begins to align more closely with the United States. So for the Soviet, that leaves them with the Arab powers in order to back. And Israel becomes this front of America in the Middle East, which the Soviets perceive as an incursion. It's a little too close to home for them. And what they wanted to do was to develop a strategy that would undermine Israel. And what they did was they drew on centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes that had been flourishing and popular in Europe. And what Soviet propaganda said was that Zionism was fascist, imperialist, racist, colonialist, that all Zionists were Nazis and all Jews were Zionists. Does it sound familiar? It sounds very familiar to me. And it's been going on since the 1960s. And we see a kind of surge in spikes. There was the Zionism is racism resolution at the United Nations in the 1970s. Because this language that the Soviets were pushing is anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, it gains traction in academic circles, and it starts to permeate academic institutions in the West. and those ideas take hold, those individuals that are teaching and researching this go on to become the chairs and the heads of departments, and they start to educate generation after generation of students in the same type of narrative. And that's how we get to the predicament that we're in today. So again, the narrative war is an old one. So tell me if this sounds familiar. This is essentially the playbook that was used and continues to be used to demonize Israel. It's got three, and it says 111. It should say 1, 2, 3. It's got three strategies to it. First is to sever the connection between the land of Israel and the people of Israel. So you're going to describe Jews as colonizers, not people with a 4,000-year-old historical and religious connection to the land. You're going to paint Israel as the aggressor in the region. You're going to ignore that Israel wanted to have two states. You're going to ignore that it wasn't Israel that declared war in 1948, that it was the surrounding Arab states. You're going to describe what happened in 1948 as the Nakba, as the catastrophe. You're going to describe what Israel did as ethnic cleansing. You're going to ignore that Jews were purged from Arab lands and from Iran. And you're certainly going to dismiss the entire history of peace offers being offered to Palestinian leaders, each and every one of which was rejected. So paint Israel as an aggressor. And the third one is to depict the Palestinians as agentless victims who have no role or responsibility, that it's not their fault that anything has happened to them, certainly not that they rejected peace deals or they have corrupt leadership or that they are brutal and suppress free speech and all this sorts of things. And then you go and you accuse Israel of the worst crime of the generation, which for us today is the accusation of genocide. So I've outlined for you the narrative framework that's being used for the past 60 or so years. And I've outlined for you some of the more technical challenges of what's happening on social media. And the reality is that given the scope and the scale of those technological challenges, in order for us to make this a more fair fight, we're going to need technical solutions as well. So imagine that if instead of designing campaigns where we had to think of an idea, write the script, develop it, film it, animate it, narrate it, imagine if we were able to use AI to much more cost effectively and quickly create campaigns, very fast online campaigns that we could push out, and we could very quickly understand which ones were gaining traction. And if once we know which ones are gaining traction, we could push that type of campaign out in a much larger way. Imagine if we were able to target audiences more effectively and rapidly with more rapid message testing, so that a little bit like polling that they do in elections, where we try to figure out what's the most effective line of narrative for different communities. So for this, you need to understand who you're trying to speak to. You can't hope to speak to everybody at once. You need to know these are the priorities communities. This is what they know about. This is what they care about. These are their values. These are the people of credibility. This is how they get information. And then you can shape your messages accordingly. Imagine if we could figure out who the top influencers were. So imagine if we could figure out if it was athletes or celebrities, or maybe it's civic leaders or religious leaders. If we could figure that out and we could feed information in that way. Imagine if we had better distribution mechanisms so that we could figure out, all right, how are we going to push information to different communities so that it will actually break free of our echo chamber and be heard by them? We'd have to figure out what's the appropriate type of format. Is it a video? Is it comedy? Is it fear-based? Is it what type of tone? What type of language? Is it animated? Is it real? All these types of different elements that come into content creation. Right now, we do it in a very slow and costly manner. We would also then need to have some sort of technological type of brain that could amplify content. It would try to offset what the algorithms are doing. Where there's algorithmic manipulation, we could try to figure out how do we maximize reach using the algorithms as well. And then we'd want to have feedback loops. So as we're putting information out, we're getting information back about what's being seen, who's seeing it outside of our echo chamber, what is resonating, what's being dismissed, and all these types of things. So it all sounds very futuristic, but the truth of it is that since October 7th, there are a lot of different individuals that have picked up different elements of what I've outlined here and are trying to work on developing these. And what Boundless is doing is we're looking at this as a whole and saying different people are doing different elements of what's been outlined here, but we need to figure out how to put together in a larger, more holistic manner so that all these different types of tactics and strategies are working together more seamlessly so that we can maximize our reach and our impact. That's going to take time to build. So in the meantime, what are we supposed to do? Because obviously we're in a crisis situation right now. So the other thing that Boundless does is we've been working to try to answer some of the key questions when it comes to messaging. And the very first question that we started with, actually well before the war, was how would we know who the most important audiences are to speak to? We know that we need to break out of the echo chamber, but who? If you don't know who you're trying to speak to, you will never be able to craft messages appropriately because you need to know a lot about your audience in order to be able to craft it, find the right dissemination channel, and the right individuals to deliver the message. So Boundless did a study last summer where we asked that question, and we worked with a major research firm, BSG, Benenson Strategy Group, to answer that question. And what we did was we actually did a study on their attitudes towards Jews. We've done it since about the war, but we did this last summer. So at the time, we thought anti-Semitism was a problem. Little did we know how much more of a problem it would be. We looked at the entire US population based on age, ethnicity, religion, geography, political values, you name it, and we looked at it and we put people into 4 quadrants. And essentially what we did was we understood their favorability towards Jewish people and their sympathy. Sorry, the bottom one should actually say sympathy or emotional connection towards Jewish people. So people that had high favorability and an emotional connection to Jews, these right here, these are our fans. The people that are low on both, these are not our fans. And then what we really had in the middle, and it was astounding, last summer it was 55, we study the American population because we're US based, but the process of how to think through this can be applied in any country. In the United States, we found that 55% of the American population actually didn't have a strong position. They said they either didn't know enough or didn't really care about Jews at all. So they were in the don't know, don't care category, and that was the blue and the green. And the thinking is, what you want to do is create a capture circle. That's what this is. And the idea is that the people that are our fans, that are relatively close to the epicenter, you want to be talking to them because you don't want them to slide backwards. You want to keep them as our fans. The people that are not our fans, if they're relatively close to the epicenter, maybe you can message and push them into the categories of at least don't know. And hopefully from the don't know, don't care, which is the green and the blue, if you message, then you can push them into the red quadrant, which is essentially what we've been trying to do. And you can see that these are all different types of communities in the US that we've been looking at. So what I'm going to share for you is when we do our messaging, we actually distill it down to very precise partner communities, depending on whatever it is we study, whether it's about the war, it's about anti-Semitism, or questions of identity and so forth. But for the purposes of being together today and having people from all over the world, what I pulled out, what I extracted from our studies is the messaging that globally is most likely to resonate. So here we are. We're 7 months into the war, and you might think, okay, well, has apathy set in? Have people stopped paying attention to the war? But actually what we found, this is not Boundless research, this is the Harvard-Harris poll, the most recent one from earlier this month, shows that 73% of the American population is still following this war very closely. So there is an appetite for people to learn more and to understand more and for us to be able to message to them. So what I've broken out on the next few slides is appropriate messaging for different topics. So starting with why support Israel. And again, I'm going to share with you messaging, and I want to remind you, this is not messaging that's intended to most resonate with Jews. It's most intended to resonate with other people. So it might not be what your line of argument or your guts tell you, but this is message tested. So first of all, why support Israel? Israel is fighting an enemy that opposes liberal values such as democracy, freedom of speech. What we have yet to successfully do in this war is to explain to people that Israel is the appetizer, that the forces of tyranny that are pushing what is happening in the world, Israel is not the prize at the end of this. Israel is just the taster course, because remember, this is like a Cold War-like situation playing out in the Middle East, but ultimately the goal is the West. And it's not actually just about Iran. Russia is watching very closely to see what is happening as they are deciding what their next moves are going to be in Ukraine or potentially further into Eastern Europe. China is watching very closely as it makes calculations about Taiwan. And Iran has already successfully destabilized the swath of land between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and obviously it has terrorists sitting on Israel's borders. It's already managed to get away with that. And the question is how much more? And they're very clear. They say Israel is the little Satan, America is the great Satan. But we have not adequately been able to explain that and send that message to Western countries. And the goal when we're communicating has to be to explain to people why it's personal, why they should care themselves. So that's why when you frame it about a war against liberal values, democracy, freedom of speech, human rights, things we care a great deal about in the West, that makes people more receptive to the message. The second thing, now especially we're talking about Rafah a lot, when we talk about why Israel is fighting in Gaza, the most important message to emphasize is that it is a rescue mission to bring the hostages home. For more than 7 months now, we have found that hostages continue to be the most important message. It should be top of mind in everything. Third, that Hamas poses a threat to the region and beyond. Again, it's not just about Israel. And if Hamas wins, it's going to send a most horrific message to other terrorist groups. That's exactly what's been happening for the last 7 months, that Western leaders have really sent a message to Russia, to Iran, to China, that we don't have the stomach for a war on terrorism. That really we're very uncomfortable with the notion that civilians might die in war, that war crimes might take place in war. And it's because things like social media and instant information and horrific scenes. But when we telegraph that message to our enemies, they don't care about civilian lives, and it just emboldens them. It helps them to understand what our weakness is. And I think that especially this is true of the campus protests that we've seen, because they're not just conveying that we don't have the stomach for the war on terror. They're conveying exactly how you win the narrative war. That all you have to do to justify any atrocity is to claim that you are fighting oppression, and that is resistance in the name of justice. And with those buzzwords, all of a sudden, you're able to literally get away with murder. So when we talk again about why is Israel still fighting this war, it's going on for 7 months. There was news reports yesterday saying that it's expected the war will last at least through 2024. So it's going to be much longer than just what we've seen. So again, emphasizing that this is a larger war for democracy, freedom, and human rights, that Israel is responding to being attacked and to reminding people of the atrocities, because we have a disbalance. They're mostly seeing what is happening in terms of the horrific scenes coming out of Gaza, and they've forgotten what happened on October 7th. So we need to remind them. Obviously, as I said, the hostages are a central message that need to be pushed to the forefront every single time. We have to emphasize that Israel is fighting to prevent further attacks, and we can bring out the videos that show Hamas leaders saying that they would repeat October 7 again and again and again if they were given the chance. We need to make a distinction, and this is really important, that for most Americans, they make a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinians. And so we need to be clear in our messaging that Israel is fighting Hamas, not the Palestinian people. And because we know that the situation is most likely going to expand and get worse, you have 50,000 Israelis that can't return to their homes in the north. You have Hezbollah firing rockets multiple times a day, every single day. We need to start messaging around what Hezbollah is and what the situation is, so that people need to know that Israel is being attacked on multiple fronts. And of course, behind these terror groups is Iran, and they're the ones that are driving the attacks, again, emphasizing that it's not the Palestinian people. And the last piece that's important in terms of having credibility is that you will not be surprised to learn that there is not a great deal of favorability towards the Israeli government and its leaders at the moment. And what people really appreciate is if we can be honest in the conversation. So if we're able to be critical of the Israeli government and its leaders when it's deserving, and also say, to be an honest broker and say that Hamas's actions, the actions of terrorists, are also not acceptable. But when we try to pretend that Israel is perfect, we sort of do ourselves a disservice. In terms of talking about Hamas, we need to tell people what it is. We know it's a terrorist organization. Most Americans do not. So we have to tell them it's an internationally recognized terrorist organization, again, making that distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people. A message that's very resonant, actually across all audiences, is the notion that Hamas uses the Palestinian people as human shields. And then we need to explain what that means. We have to explain that if Hamas isn't unseated, if it isn't taken apart by the IDF, that they will regroup, rearm, and reattack. And we also found that to be a very resonant message, that people, again, understand terrorism at large, and that they can understand that if it isn't stopped, it's just going to reemerge and there'll be another war again and again and again. And again, telling people about Hamas and its charter that it literally exists in order to destroy Israel and to hunt down Jewish people. In terms of the ceasefire, the most resonant messaging is to talk about the hostages. When you ask people, do you think there should be a ceasefire? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. But when you revise the question and say, should there be a ceasefire without the hostages coming free? Fewer than half believe that that's acceptable. So again, putting the hostages at the front of the messaging is very effective. I said this before, we need to start messaging about Hezbollah now. People do not know what it is. They don't know what Hamas is. They certainly don't know what Hezbollah is. And I believe it's going to be a big issue. So we need to prime the messaging right now by talking about it quite a little more. The two hardest things to message around in this war, obviously, is the humanitarian crisis and the accusations of genocide. So I'll say this up front, there's no silver bullet for this. There's nothing that sort of knocks it out of the park, but the best we've been able to find in terms of messaging is, first of all, the notion that Hamas uses the Palestinians as human shields, and then all the efforts that Israel has been taking. So whether it's sending warnings, the evacuation corridors, of course, allowing in truckloads of aid, airdropping aid, and so forth, all those examples of the ways that Israel is trying to mitigate against the humanitarian crisis. On the issue of genocide, we need to educate on what genocide is and what it isn't. It's become just rhetoric out in the language. In the May 2021 war, we saw the word apartheid being the main rhetoric. In this war, it's genocide. In order to counter genocide, people need to understand that the Jewish people have a historic connection to the land of Israel. We need to pick apart the notion that we're colonialists. Remember when I talked about the narrative framing, the first one is to sever the ties between Israel and the Jewish people. So we need to stitch that back together so that people understand that we have a right to the land of Israel. We have a right to be there. Again, that's to talk about how Hamas is using the Palestinians as human shields, and that they are the ones that are endangering Palestinian lives, and that the war could end tomorrow if they would just release the hostages. And the last piece here, the other thing that we test is Boundless will identify who are the most important audiences. We'll do a lot of testing to understand what do they know, what do they believe, what's important to them. We'll do message testing. And the last piece of the puzzle is you need to figure out who the appropriate messengers are. So in the Jewish community, people like to hear from me, but it turns out outside the Jewish community, not so much. I'm okay with that, but we have to figure out who does have credibility. So we actually did a survey quite recently where we tested this. This one had to do with anti-Semitism. And what we found is that amongst different groups that we tested, the most impactful messenger would be a Holocaust survivor. So that's important to know, but obviously this is not a long-term strategy. And then here you can really see that for different communities, it's different people have credibility. This really goes to the point of being able to segment and identify your audiences and then be able to tailor the messaging and the dissemination appropriately. So for the general population, a faith leader is very effective, also for young evangelicals. So you can see that other times friends and family, always very, very impactful. And for young Blacks, it was a civil rights leader. That's it. Let me take these slides down and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I just learned so much from that. That was so informative. So my first question, this is going to be a question from me. Last weekend, after the tragic incident in Rafah, the Palestinian narrative took hold right away because they don't bother to investigate. Israel takes the time to find out what really occurred. But by the time they even know, a narrative has already taken hold. For many, the claim that Israel committed a massacre with an airstrike on a tent camp will live in their minds, even though nothing of the sort happened. How can we get our story out faster when the lie is so much faster and easier to formulate than the truth?
There's a famous Mark Twain quote that says, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes." Sometimes I've heard it as its pants, but that's the point, is that yes, a lie travels really fast. And this is not the first time we saw that. We saw that on October 17th with the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza. there was a claim that Israel had fired on a rocket, that 500 people were killed. And this was picked up not just by the major media outlets, but by government leaders, by Médecins Sans Frontières, by all sorts of different credible actors. And then obviously it took about a day to demonstrate that it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired. They tried to kill Israelis. Instead, they ended up killing themselves. And then you had the State Department, government after government. But what's interesting is the people who didn't retract. So there's two problems. First of all the people that I mentioned, or the entities that I mentioned, the major media outlets, the government leaders, the major human rights or humanitarian aid organizations, shame on them. But it's not the first time this has happened. This is an old strategy that's been going on for years and years and years. And that shame on them that they got caught out again. And I think it's very important that we say that and we convey to them. And I think it's incredibly important that CAMRA does this, that it holds major media outlets to account for these types of things. But the problem is that they continue to live. So I actually was just looking, Rashida Tlaib posted about the Al-Ahli hospital the same day, October 17th. It's been proven by the State Department and numerous other intelligence and governments to be wrong. Her post is still up. It's got 35 million engagements. That's unacceptable from a sitting member of Congress. So I'm not sure that we can stop people from lying and spreading misinformation or disinformation on social media, but I think we can certainly hold individuals to higher account, because that's not just an issue that affects us. If you go back to the World Economic Forum report, this is an issue. Truth and credibility and reliance and belief in major organizations is an issue that actually affects all of our safety and security in the Western world.
Great, thank you. Okay, you said that people who have more education about Israel, I believe you said specifically people who have more Israel education tend to be more supportive of Israel. Is that quoting you correctly?
It's more education about a variety of things. So about Israel for sure, about Judaism, Jewish history, Jewish connection to the land of Israel, about the conflict. The more education you have, the more likely you are to support Israel.
So how can we get more of that out there?
This is a huge question. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is really reactive. But if we ever want to hope to get ahead of this problem, we really have to address, first of all, education in general, how people learn about Jewish people and Israel in general, not just inside of the Jewish community. And we're also going to have to try to address some of these issues around disinformation. And again, it feels very personal about us, but when you think about it, the reason that disinformation is topping the charts on the World Economic Forum's list this year is because about half of the global adult population will go to an election this year. There's huge stakes at play for who's in control, and that's why we're seeing these campaigns develop. The issue of education is that we've been behind the ball. We haven't invested appropriately. Dara Horn will tell you that we've overemphasized Holocaust education. And if you want to define who the Jewish people is, it's not just the fact that 6 million of us were murdered in the Holocaust. That's not the basis of who we are and our identity. It's not how we walk through the world. So we really have to reimagine what it looks like to tell our story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we as Jews have just kind of been, minding our own business, living our own lives, while our adversaries were kind of making inroads into these areas and pushing their own narrative. And I have to agree with you. We need to be a little bit more on the offensive on this issue. Next question. So this is a question about Qatar and the huge amounts of money that it has been donating to American universities, buying influence and sway. How exactly does their money infiltrate campuses? How does it affect hiring staff, funding protests, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. I think Qatar is a terrible actor. I mean, look at the fact that Hamas leaders live like kings inside of Qatar. And then this is supposed to be, quote unquote, our honest broker in hostage negotiations. It's appalling. And it's exactly right. It's not just Qatar. It's other nations that have funded chairs inside of universities that will allow them to be able to have sway over who is hired, what the curriculum is, and so forth. And I actually think that this is an issue of national security. It's So there should probably be legislation that put greater parameters on this, and certainly better oversight from the administration. I mean, there's a lot to say. I'm sure everybody would agree about how so many campus administrations have fallen short.
Someone is pointing out that one problem with the AI approach is that searches prioritize volume and quantity over quality. And how can we overcome? I don't understand a lot of this question. LLMs prioritize volume. I don't know. Maybe you know what an LLM is, and a Google search is Boolean in nature. So how do we overcome that?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily suggesting that we've probably of all 35 million people, 40 million people have seen the Eyes on Rafa image. I'm not necessarily talking about AI in the sense of creating type of inauthentic content, but you can use like ChatGPT, for example. Right now we have that to write scripts. When we're talking about AI, I'm not talking about us putting out misinformation and disinformation. I'm saying what's going to make us more effective and more productive at trying to figure out content more quickly and then figuring out what's going to go viral. Because right now it's a very slow and tedious process. And the idea is it's like A/B testing. You put out multiple things, you figure out what's most effective, and that's where you put your resources once you know what's most effective. In general, the issue of AI and manipulation is a huge problem because we're very close, probably at the point where you can watch a video and not know it looks like the president of the United States, sounds like the president of the United States, and it's all inauthentic. And there are nonprofits, and there's certainly conversations that take place amongst policymakers about the need. It's like food labeling, that it needs to have a labeling system to know whether it's organic or if it's AI manipulated, just as the way we do it with foods, so that you know what's inside and you can make informed decisions about that. So that's something I think is going to be a question ultimately for the social media platforms to figure out if they're going to label it. And then probably because they will never take responsibility in a way that's going to keep the public safe, probably ultimately an issue for legislators to deal with as well.
I think this is a question that probably everybody here wants to know. What can an individual do? And what is the best way for an individual to have an impact?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot by North Americans, never by Israelis. And I want to say a word about that. So a few things. The approach that I take is basically that my living mantra is that none of this is acceptable and I won't accept any of it as normal. And that is sort of the approach that I take into all of this, because it is like a tsunami and it's very easy to sort of say, well, what difference can I make? But the truth of it is every single one of us says we refuse to normalize and accept what is happening here. And I'm going to stand up and speak up on every single issue. It's wildly impactful. So that starts with the notion, I reject the notion of anybody that treats us as if we had this coming. That's an outrageous notion, and I reject it completely. The notion that Jewish people, and especially Jewish kids, have to hide their Jewish identity, that's outrageous. Absolutely reject it. We live in an age of identity politics, when people are encouraged to identify as whatever they want. And the one thing that you can't safely identify as is Jewish, that's outrageous. That's hypocrisy, and it needs to be pointed out. I am sick to death of people that will speak with sympathy about dead Jews, but not take real action to protect living Jews. So again, I'm not interested in anybody's pity. I want meaningful action. And if you're not providing meaningful action, then I don't care to hear a single more empty statements, empty tweets. And we're going to call it out and demand more of people. Israelis never ask me what they can do because they inherently understand that whatever their skills and whatever their network is where they're going to go and apply it. And we saw this especially after October 7th. There were people that I met. One was a theater director, and she said to me, it was about an hour where I thought, what can I possibly do? There's nothing for me. And what she did is she went out into the streets in Tel Aviv about a week after the war had started. And there was a man whose entire family had been kidnapped to Gaza, who was sitting outside the Kiryat, the military headquarters in Gaza. And he sat there with a chair and a sign that said, my family has been kidnapped to Gaza. And what she did was she said, well, this needs more public attention. And as a director, I know something about how you can bring some public attention. And she printed out 253 photographs, one for each one of the hostages, and she put a call out and asked people to come outside the Kiryat, and she tried to match people up between the photograph and the people that were there, so that there would be a similarity. If the person had red hair, maybe give them the Bibas, one of the Bibas children. And she had them stand in a line alongside this man, just holding the photograph, very standing silently, but very powerfully. And the impact of what that looked like and the sort of solidarity that it provided both to the hostage families and to the public attention and the media attention that it garnered. The point of this story is the notion that we always are trying to figure out what's the most maximal thing we can do, but it's so much smaller than that. It's what is your core expertise and who do you know? And that's really, that Venn diagram is what you can do. Because God knows we're going to use some lawyers with some class action lawsuits. We could use business people that are putting pressure on Qatar and ostracizing them from every forum in this world until they actually take meaningful action to release our hostages. We need more billboards. We need more public art campaigns. We need more of everything. So the question is just, what are you going to figure out? Where are you going to start?
That was a great answer. And I think your first sentence at the beginning of that answer sounded like you were paraphrasing Pirkei Avot, which is which I'm sure I'm not getting the exact quote right either. It is not our responsibility to finish the job, but nor are we free to desist from starting, right? We all have to do our own part. Is it good or bad that so many people are following? Oh, let me just say, we just have a couple minutes left, so this will probably be our last question. Is it good or bad that so many people are following the Israel-Hamas war as opposed to the other issues that may be impacting greater numbers of people?
Yeah, well, that's part of the hypocrisy that we should be calling out, which is the notion that this is the worst war in the history of wars, or that these are the war crimes that are being committed on any scale that you look at in comparison to other wars that have taken place in the last decade. It's not proportional to the type of media coverage and certainly to the level of vitriol and vilification that's going on. And I think that's part of the hypocrisy that needs to constantly be called out. This all eyes on Rafah, all eyes on Rafah. Where were you all eyes on Rafah when Hamas took over and threw political opponents off the roofs? Where were you when they stole international aid dollars and turned Gaza into a terrorist stronghold? Where were you on October 7th? Where were you with our hostages for this last 7 months? I mean, this is the sort of thing that I think we need to be answering back and not be silent in the face of. I saw there 54 questions. I'm sorry for everybody else.
I think we can get in one more, and I'm kind of scrolling through. What short answer do you suggest when others say or shout or post or put on posters that Israel is committing genocide or Israel is an apartheid state? What's the best retort? That's not a short answer, is it?
It's not short. So first of all, like I said, we've message tested that extensively, and I shared with you, and by the way, those messages that I spoke about, I'm very happy to share them with camera to circulate to everybody here. That tells you what it is. But I mean, I think the thing to know is that there's no shortcuts here. If we don't want to be playing defense for the end of time, then we really need to have greater investments in what it looks like to have real relationships with other people outside of our echo chamber, because there's no tweet that's going to undo this harm. We're going to start to have people thinking differently and being more receptive and questioning if we're actually holding relationships and that we are embedded with those communities so that they feel like we care about their issues, so that they will then care about our issues.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, and my apologies to those whose questions we couldn't get to. Thank you so much again, Aviva. That was a very thought-provoking discussion and very informative. You've given us a lot to think about, as your work always does. I also want to say that if you like what you heard today, or if you feel that Camera in general provides a needed voice in current discussions and debates about Israel and Jews, I hope that you will consider making a donation to our organization. Just go to camera.org. You'll see a big red button there where you can make a gift, which we very much appreciate. We also would love for every one of you to join our media response team if you're not already on it. It's our volunteer team of letter writers who protest inaccuracies in the media. Many letters to editor, which you see printed in major newspapers around the world, are actually from people who are part of CAMRA's letter writing team. Thousands of people who participate in our many campaigns. We'd like you to be a part of it. If you're already a member, please invite one or two of your trusted friends to join. They can quickly sign up by emailing Sarah Miller at letters@camra.org. Sarah will get them quickly signed up to receive our action alerts, which are a powerful way for you to help combat media disinformation. The bigger we are, the more impact we have. So please get others to join. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. Have a great day. This concludes our program.